And so we arrive at the point that underpins everything that has been said so far. The question that seems simple, almost innocent, but which carries a much greater psychological, philosophical, and existential weight than it appears. A question that, when truly heard, not just thought about, begins to dismantle deep internal structures. The question is direct, but its impact is not immediate. It echoes, it lingers, it disturbs silently. Who is that silent observer inside you? Notice how the mind tries to respond quickly. Perhaps a definition emerges, perhaps a memory of something you've read, perhaps a spiritual, psychological, or philosophical explanation. But all of these are still thoughts trying to capture something that precedes thought itself. And it is precisely here that the mystery begins to take shape. Because this question isn't asking for a concept, it's pointing to an experience. A conscious experience that happens before words, before interpretations, before conclusions. Psychologically, we've been trained to answer everything with an analytical mind. But this question demands a different posture. Presence. Observe calmly. When a thought arises attempting to answer, who is the observer? That thought is perceived by something. When an emotion appears, curiosity, doubt, slight discomfort, that emotion is also perceived. So, again, who perceives? Who is here, consciously, following this process now? This is a practical question disguised as philosophy. It's not meant to take you away from real life, but to bring you back to the center of human experience. Because, in everyday life, almost all psychological suffering stems from automatic identification with what arises in the mind. Thoughts are taken as absolute truths. Emotions are taken as identity. Fleeting sensations gain permanent weight. But the silent observer does not suffer in this way. He is not confused. He does not get lost. He does not react automatically. He sees. And perhaps you are beginning to notice something important. This observer has no clear form. It has no image. It has no defined personality. It does not present itself as a voice saying, "I am the observer." It manifests as clarity, as space, as a feeling of being conscious without effort. That is why so many contemplative traditions speak of silence. Not external silence, but that inner silence where experience happens without being constantly commented on. An aesthetic, minimalist silence, almost imperceptible, but profoundly stable. It is present when you perceive a thought without engaging with it, when you notice an emotion without trying to change it, when you breathe and know that you are breathing. And here, an interesting tension arises. The mind wants to appropriate this experience. It wants to say, "I understand." It wants to transform the observer into just another mental object. But every time this happens, something escapes, because the observer cannot be observed in the same way as a thought. It is the field where everything is observed. Perhaps upon hearing this, you feel a slight psychological discomfort, a feeling of, "I can't quite grasp this completely." And that's a good sign. It means you're not just consuming ideas, but approaching an internal boundary where thought loses some of its power, where consciousness begins to recognize itself. It's not about believing in anything. It's not about adopting a new spiritual identity. It's about perceiving, directly and consciously, that there is a dimension of experience that doesn't change, even when everything else changes. Thoughts come and go, emotions arise and disappear. External situations transform, but something remains, observing all of this with the same silent neutrality. And perhaps that's the most transformative part. This observer isn't distant from your practical life. It's present when you feel anxiety and become aware of the anxiety, when you put pressure on yourself and become aware of the pressure, when you get lost in distractions and suddenly realize you were distracted. That moment of awareness is the observer in action. The more you acknowledge this, the more inner space is created. Space between you and your impulses. Space between you and your fears. Space between you and automatic narratives about who you are or should be. This space doesn't eliminate challenges, but it completely changes how you relate to them. And notice how this perception doesn't require excessive effort. It doesn't ask you to force your mind into silence. It simply invites you to notice what is already happening. Consciousness is already present. The observer is already there. What is usually lacking is attention. Perhaps now you can feel, even if only for a few seconds, this silent presence accompanying everything. Don't try to hold on to it. Don't try to define it. Just acknowledge it. And notice how, by doing so, something slows down. Something organizes itself. Something becomes simpler. This question, who is the silent observer within you, doesn't need to be answered today. In fact, it wasn't meant to be answered all at once. It was meant to accompany you, to infiltrate your daily life, to reappear when you're on autopilot, to gently remind you that there is a more conscious way to inhabit your own experience. From here on, we'll delve even deeper into this point, dismantling common misconceptions and showing why identifying the observer with thoughts, emotions, or personal identity is the root of much unnecessary psychological suffering. But before we continue, I want to hear from you. At the end of this video, leave a comment with the phrase that makes the most sense to you right now. I am not my thoughts. Or, if you prefer something even simpler, I observe. If this reflection resonates with you, also write the word consciousness in the comments. This helps the video reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of deep, practical, and conscious content. And if you feel this space is different, leave a like and subscribe to continue this investigation together, because what comes next delves even deeper into this experience that we are only beginning to explore now. If you've made it this far, it's because something within you already recognizes that this question isn't strange. It may be difficult to explain, difficult to put into words, but it's not unknown. In fact, this experience is more common and more universal than any psychological theory or philosophical system. All human beings, at some point in their lives, have touched upon this silent point, even without knowing how to name it. Perhaps it was in a simple moment. A moment of distraction looking out the window, a second of silence before sleep, a deep sigh after a hard day, or even in the midst of an emotional crisis when, despite the inner turmoil, something within you seemed to simply notice everything happening, thoughts passing by, emotions arising, sensations shifting, and yet a conscious presence there, intact. This is the universal experience that is rarely recognized as such. Thoughts are constantly passing by. Mental images appear without warning. Internal phrases emerge as if someone were speaking inside your head. The mind projects scenarios, relives memories, creates expectations. Psychologically, this happens automatically. It's not something you need to learn to do. The mind thinks for itself. But observe more closely. You notice these thoughts passing by. They enter the field of consciousness and, after a while, leave. Some stay longer. Others disappear quickly. Some seem important. Others are completely random. But they all have something in common. They are seen. The same thing happens with emotions. A feeling of anxiety arises in the body, a tightness in the chest, a racing heart, then perhaps sadness, or irritation, or sudden joy. Emotions don't ask permission to appear either. They arise as natural phenomena of human experience. But again, something within you perceives these emotions. Something notices the intensity. Something recognizes the change. And here is the point that is almost never consciously explored. If thoughts and emotions are perceived, then they cannot be what you perceive. This distinction is simple, yet profoundly transformative. And it doesn't belong to a specific culture, a specific religion, or an isolated tradition. It is part of the basic structure of human consciousness. From an early age, however, we are taught to ignore this. Emotional education rarely teaches observation. It teaches reaction, control, and judgment. The mind learns to define itself by the content that appears within it. I am anxious. I am like this. I overthink. But no one asks, who notices the anxiety? Who notices the excess of thoughts? This collective forgetfulness creates unnecessary suffering, because when you believe you are what comes to mind, each thought gains too much weight. Each emotion becomes an identity. Each internal state seems definitive, and this generates psychological fatigue, internal confusion, a constant feeling of struggling with oneself. But direct experience shows something different. There's something inside you that simply observes all of this, not coldly, but neutrally, not indifferently, but with space. This something doesn't try to stop thoughts from passing. It doesn't try to hold back emotions. It doesn't try to fix anything. It simply accompanies you. Perhaps now, as you listen to these words, you can notice this happening. Thoughts about what is being said. Subtle emotions of curiosity, agreement, or doubt. Sensations in the body. And, at the same time, a silent presence that knows all of this is happening. This presence is not special. It is not mystical in a fantastical sense. It is simple, minimalist, natural. So natural that it goes unnoticed. Just as you don't constantly think about the act of seeing while you are seeing, you don't usually think about the act of being conscious while you are conscious. But when you start to notice, something changes. It's not the outside that changes, it's the inside that changes. The relationship with experience transforms. Life continues with its challenges, its demands, its pains and pleasures. But the way you position yourself internally begins to gain more space, more clarity, more kindness. And perhaps that's why so many people at different times in their lives report a feeling of something bigger or something deeper, without being able to explain exactly what it is. Not because they found something external, but because they touched, even briefly, that silent observation point that has always been present. This experience doesn't require absolute silence, isolation, or complex practices. It can happen amidst chaos, in traffic, during a difficult conversation, in a moment of anxiety. All it takes is for you to be aware for a moment of what's happening instead of getting completely lost in it. And the more you recognize this, the clearer it becomes that this experience is not individual in the common sense. It is human, universal. Everyone feels it. Few acknowledge it. Even fewer delve into it. Therefore, this video isn't about learning something new, but about remembering. Remembering something that has been experienced countless times, but never received enough attention. Remembering that, behind every mental narrative, there is a consciousness that observes without needing to define itself. From here on out, we're going to start dismantling a central misconception that prevents many people from deepening this experience: the tendency to confuse the observer with what is being observed. But before we continue, I want to invite you to actively participate in this. Finally, leave a simple sentence in the comments that represents your experience so far. It could be, "I understand," or "Something is watching." If you want something even more direct, just write "Presence." These comments help the video reach more people who are also ready for this kind of conscious, psychological, and profound reflection. And if this makes sense to you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because the next step delves deeper into exactly where this experience begins to become even clearer, and perhaps a little disconcerting. Now that this universal experience is becoming clearer, it's inevitable to touch on the point where almost everyone gets lost, not for lack of intelligence, nor for lack of sensitivity, but for conditioning. A deep psychological conditioning, repeated since childhood, reinforced by culture, language, and the way we learn to relate to the mind. This is perhaps the most common and most silent error of human experience, believing that I am my thoughts. Notice how natural this phrase sounds. It has never been questioned. From an early age, we learn to define ourselves by what we think, by what we believe, by what goes through our heads. If a fearful thought arises, we say, "I am afraid." Yes, if a thought of inadequacy arises, we say, "I am incapable." If a recurring negative thought arises, we say, "That's me." Psychologically, this seems logical. Philosophically, it seems coherent. But when observed with more conscious attention, something begins to not add up. Because thoughts are events. They arise, change, and disappear. They vary throughout the day, the week, a lifetime. A thought that seemed like absolute truth yesterday may seem irrelevant tomorrow. A strong belief from years ago may simply lose its meaning, and yet something within you remains, perceiving all these changes. Even so, the mind insists on appropriating the content. It says, "This is me. And that's when the suffering begins to solidify. When you completely identify with what you think, every thought becomes a threat or a promise. Every internal dialogue becomes a personal judgment. Every mental narrative becomes a story about who you are. Buddhism points directly to this point, not as a distant theory, but as a practical observation of experience. It doesn't say that thoughts are bad. It doesn't say that the mind should be eliminated. What it points to is something much more subtle. Thoughts are objects of consciousness, not the subject. In other words, you are not the thought. You observe the thought. This change seems small, almost insignificant at first glance, but it completely alters your relationship with your mind. When you believe you are your thoughts, you live within them. When you realize you are observing your thoughts, you create space. And space is psychological freedom. Observe now, as you listen to this. A thought may arise agreeing. Another may arise disagreeing. Perhaps one says, "That makes sense." Perhaps another says, "That's complicated." But notice, you perceive both. They appear in the same field of attention. They don't compete with each other for control of consciousness. They simply arise and pass. And yet, there is an almost automatic tendency to choose one of them and say, "That's me." This choice is unconscious most of the time. It happens quickly. And the faster it happens, the more invisible it becomes. That's how identification takes hold. The mistake isn't in thinking. Thinking is natural. The mistake lies in becoming confused with what is being thought, in losing sight of the silent observer who remains intact regardless of the mental content. When this confusion happens, life becomes a sequence of automatic reactions. The mind reacts to itself. Emotions react to thoughts. Thoughts react to emotions. And the observer is forgotten in the background. From a conscious point of view, this generates exhaustion. From a psychological point of view, it generates anxiety, rumination, and excessive self-criticism. From an existential point of view, it generates a constant feeling of being out of place, of never truly being at peace, even when everything seems to be fine externally. Buddhism calls this, in simple terms, identification, not as guilt, not as a moral failing, but as a deeply ingrained mental habit, a habit that can be seen, understood, and gradually dissolved through conscious observation. When you begin to realize that you are observing your thoughts, something very important happens. You stop fighting them, not because they disappear, but because they lose the absolute power they once had. A negative thought may still arise, but it no longer defines who you are. A difficult emotion may still appear, but it no longer takes over your entire identity. This is not repression. This is not denial. This is clarity. And this clarity doesn't come from repeating positive phrases, nor from trying to replace bad thoughts with good ones. It comes from realizing, repeatedly, that there is something within you that sees the thought born, develop, and disappear. This something doesn't need to agree or disagree. It simply recognizes it. Perhaps now you can see how radical this is. Because if you are not your thoughts, then many of the stories you tell yourself begin to lose their solidity. Labels, judgments, comparisons, expectations, all of that continues to exist, but not with the same psychological weight. They become events, not absolute truths. And this is precisely where many people feel fear, because the conditioned mind likes control. It likes a fixed identity. It likes to know who I am. But the silent observer doesn't cling to definitions. He is fluid, open, conscious. He doesn't need to assert himself. He doesn't need to defend himself. Therefore, this teaching is not comfortable at first. It destabilizes certainties, it dismantles old narratives, but at the same time it offers something rare: lightness. A lightness that does not depend on external circumstances, but on how you relate internally to your own mind. And the more you recognize this pattern of identification, the easier it becomes to perceive it in everyday life. The moment a thought arises and you say, "That's just a thought," something has already changed. The moment an emotion appears and you realize this is being observed, something is internally reorganized. It's not enlightenment, it's not perfection, it's conscious practice applied to real human experience. In a moment, we'll delve even deeper into this point, showing why the mind insists so much on identifying with it, and what happens when that identification begins to weaken naturally. But before we continue, I want to open a little space for discussion with you. If this makes sense, leave a short, uncomplicated comment. I am not my thoughts. Or if you prefer something even simpler, I observe. You can also write just one word: clarity or awareness. These comments help the video reach more people who are ready for this kind of deep, psychological, and conscious reflection. And if you feel this content is opening something up inside you, leave a like and subscribe, because the next segment delves deeper into exactly what happens when this identification begins, little by little, to dissolve. To understand the Buddhist perspective on all of this, it's important to make something very clear from the start. Buddhism isn't trying to give you a new identity, nor is it trying to replace an old concept with a more sophisticated one. It doesn't want you to believe in something different, but to observe something that is already happening. And perhaps that's precisely why this approach is so disconcerting and, at the same time, so liberating. When it's said that Buddhism doesn't point to a fixed self, this doesn't mean it denies human experience, personality, or the practical individuality of daily life. You still have a name, a history, preferences, memories, responsibilities. All of that continues to function. What changes is how it's viewed internally. Buddhism doesn't ask you to destroy the self, but to investigate whether that self is truly as solid, permanent, and independent as it appears to be. And when this investigation begins consciously and directly, something curious happens. You begin to realize that what you call self is composed of thoughts, emotions, sensations, memories, and impulses that are constantly changing. Nothing there remains the same for long. Everything reorganizes itself, transforms, emerges, and disappears. Yet there is something that perceives all these changes without altering along with them. This is where Buddhism points, not to the content, but to the field where the content appears. Instead of asking, "Who am I?" the Buddhist perspective invites you to observe what is being perceived now, and then notice what you perceive. This shift is subtle, yet profoundly practical. It removes the focus from the constant attempt to define oneself and places attention on the direct experience of consciousness. The conditioned mind likes to cling to definitions. It wants something stable to lean on. That's why the idea of there not being a fixed self usually generates resistance. But when you observe calmly, you realize that Buddhism isn't taking anything away from you. It's simply pointing out that what you believe to be fixed has always been fluid. And this is not some distant philosophical belief. It is something that can be perceived now. A thought arises saying, "I." Another thought arises describing that "I." An emotion appears associated with that identity. But all of this is seen. All of this appears before something that observes, and that something doesn't need to say "I am." It is simply conscious. Buddhism draws attention to this observant awareness, not as something special, elevated, or separate from ordinary life, but as the basis of all experience. It's not something you need to achieve, it's something you need to recognize. And this distinction completely changes the relationship with spiritual practice, mental health, and self-knowledge. Many people come into contact with Buddhism expecting techniques to control the mind, calm thoughts, or eliminate difficult emotions. But the deeper approach is not about control. It's about clarity. It's about realizing that consciousness doesn't need to control what arises within it to remain present. It is already vast enough to contain everything. When you understand this, even initially, a subtle psychological relief begins to emerge, an inner peace, because the responsibility of being someone all the time begins to diminish. You don't need to maintain a fixed image of yourself. You don't need to constantly defend an identity. You don't need to fight against every thought that appears. Buddhism doesn't say you don't exist. It says something much more subtle. What you call I is not a solid object that can be found in the way the mind imagines. What exists is a flow of experience being observed by a present consciousness, and this consciousness doesn't need labels to function. This point is profoundly aesthetic in the most minimalist sense of the word. It removes excess. It simplifies. It cuts through the noise. Instead of adding more concepts, it removes confusion. Instead of building something new, it reveals what was already there, hidden beneath layers of thought. And perhaps you now realize why this perspective is so relevant to conscious mental health. Much of psychological suffering stems from rigid identity, from the idea of, I am like this, I have always been like this, I will never change. When this rigidity begins to be questioned through direct observation, space opens up for transformation without internal violence. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be denied. Thoughts keep arising. Emotions keep appearing. Life keeps happening. The difference is that all of this is now seen as experience, not as the final definition of who you are. And the more you recognize this observant consciousness, the clearer it becomes that it doesn't belong to a specific culture, belief system, or system. It is human, universal, simple, silent. It is present in moments of tranquility as well as in moments of chaos. What changes is whether you are aware of it or not. Perhaps now it makes more sense why Buddhism insists so much on observation, mindfulness, and presence. Not as mechanical techniques, but as a way to reconnect with this basic dimension of experience. A dimension that doesn't need to be created, only recognized. From here on, we will delve even deeper into this perspective, exploring what happens when this awareness begins to be confused again with personal thoughts, emotions, and narratives, and why this confusion returns with such force even after moments of clarity. Before we continue, if this perspective resonates with you, leave a simple, concise comment below. It could be, "There is no fixed self," or "Consciousness observes." If you prefer something even more direct, just write, "Presence" or "Clarity." These comments help this content reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and philosophy applied to the human experience. And if you feel this video is opening up a different inner space, please like and subscribe, because the next segment delves deeper into exactly where this observation begins to become even more subtle and even more transformative. To continue moving forward with clarity, it is now essential to clear the ground, because many people even begin to perceive this space of silent observation, but soon become confused again when trying to transform it into something specific. The mind wants to give form, wants to name, wants to appropriate the experience, and it is precisely there that a new layer of confusion arises. Therefore, before any further exploration, it is fundamental to understand what the silent observer is not. And this aspect, when truly understood in a practical and conscious way, often generates something rare: psychological relief. The observer is not a thought. This seems obvious when stated like this, but in daily experience, almost no one perceives it clearly. Thoughts arise all the time, commenting on reality, interpreting, judging, comparing. They speak in the first person. They say, "I think," "I feel," "I am." And because they speak as if they were you, they end up being confused with who you are. But observe carefully. A thought arises, remains for a few seconds, then is replaced by another. If you were that thought, you would disappear along with it. However, something remains, perceiving the constant exchange. The observer is present before the thought arises and continues after it is gone. The observer is not an emotion either. Emotions are intense, all-encompassing, often dominant. When they arise, they seem to occupy everything. Anger, fear, sadness, joy. Each colors the experience in a different way. Psychologically, this makes it seem like, "I am this now." But if you observe carefully, you realize that even the strongest emotion is felt for something. It is perceived in the body, recognized by the mind, accompanied by consciousness. The emotion changes, fluctuates, transforms. The observer does not. He does not become sad when sadness arises, nor anxious when anxiety appears. He perceives the emotion without becoming the emotion. And here, many people take a deeper breath for the first time. Because realizing this means you no longer need to fight against what you feel to remain whole. Emotion can exist without defining you. The observer is not the personality. Personality is a set of patterns, likes, dislikes, habits, learned traits, social and family conditioning. It's useful for navigating the world, but it's not fixed. Just look at your own history to realize this. You don't think the same way you did years ago. You don't react the same way. You don't feel the same way. Personality matures, adapts, sometimes defends itself, and yet, something within you perceives these changes over time. This something doesn't age along with the psychological traits. It remains, recognizing the transformations. When you confuse the observer with the personality, rigidity arises. The idea of, "I am this way and that's it," emerges. When this confusion begins to dissolve, internal flexibility emerges, a space where change is not a threat, but a natural movement. The observer is not the inner voice either. This point is especially important. Many people believe that the observer is that calm voice that sometimes appears commenting on something in a more rational or spiritual way. But that is still thought. It is still language. It is still mind. The true observer does not speak. He does not comment. He does not explain. He does not advise. He simply knows that something is happening. The observer's silence is not absence. It is presence without noise. And realizing this usually brings profound peace. Because, for the first time, you no longer need to follow any inner voice. Not the critical one, not the motivating one, not the spiritual one. They can all exist, but none need to be confused with who you are. When these distinctions begin to become clear, something reorganizes itself internally. Life doesn't suddenly become perfect, but it becomes lighter. Excess diminishes. Internal pressure drops. The mind continues to function, but it doesn't govern alone. It comes to be seen as a tool, not as an identity. And perhaps you now realize how profoundly practical this understanding is for conscious mental health. Because much of the suffering doesn't come from the thoughts or emotions themselves, but from merging with them, from the automatic belief that what arises in the mind is me. When this merging begins to loosen, even slightly, space opens up to breathe within the experience itself. This space doesn't need to be created. It has always been there. What happens is that, by removing false identifications, what remains is conscious silence, a stable, aesthetic, minimalist silence, a silence that doesn't need to be defended, explained, or sustained. And here it's important to say something very honestly. Perceiving what the observer is not doesn't mean you'll never identify with them again. Identification is an old habit. It returns, sometimes forcefully, sometimes subtly. But now there's something new, clarity. And clarity changes everything. Because even when identification returns, it can be perceived. You start to notice, here I am believing in that thought again. Here I am getting confused by this emotion again. And just realizing that something already starts to loosen. This process isn't instantaneous. It's gradual. It's human. It happens at the pace of your own observation. And the more you recognize what the observer is not, the easier it becomes to remain with what they are, even without defining them. And it is precisely here that many people feel, for the first time, a different kind of peace. Not the peace of not having problems, but the peace of not being consumed internally by everything that arises. A silent, discreet, but extremely real peace. In a moment, we'll delve into an even more subtle point: how silence becomes the observer's language and why they don't need to express themselves to be present. But before we continue, I want to hear from you, simply and consciously. If anything here made sense, leave a short sentence in the comments without explaining too much. It could be, "I am not the voice of my mind," or "This has been observed." If you prefer just one word, write silence, clarity, or presence. These comments help the video reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and philosophy applied to the human experience. And if you feel this content is giving you more inner space, please like and subscribe, because the next segment delves deeper into exactly how this silence begins to reveal itself even more clearly in everyday life. As all of this becomes clearer, a point emerges that often seems strange at first, but which is absolutely central to understanding the silent observer in a practical and conscious way. A point that, when truly felt, and not just intellectually understood, profoundly changes the relationship with the mind. This point is simple, but radical. The observer does not speak, and this, to a mind accustomed to constant noise, sounds almost like emptiness. But it isn't. The observer doesn't speak because he doesn't need to express himself in words. Words belong to thought. Language belongs to the mind. Every internal phrase, even the most beautiful, spiritual, or poetic, is still a mental movement. It is still something that arises and disappears. The observer, on the other hand, neither arises nor disappears in the same way. He is present before the word arises and continues after it dissolves. When you perceive a thought, there's no need for something to say, "I perceived it." Perception happens before any comment. There's a direct, immediate, silent recognition. That's the observer in action. And perhaps you can notice it now. While listening to these words, there is an inner space that is not repeating everything, nor analyzing each sentence, nor trying to reach a conclusion. There is something simply observing. This something doesn't need to agree or disagree. It perceives. This perception is the language of the observer. In everyday life, we've been trained to associate presence with action, with response, with speech. If something doesn't react, it seems like it's not there. But in conscious experience, the opposite happens. The quieter the perception, the more present it is. Silence is not the absence of experience. It is the absence of unnecessary noise. The observer's silence is not emptiness, not erasure, not emotional anesthesia. It is alive. It is attentive. It contains everything without needing to mix with anything. Thoughts may be noisy. Emotions may be intense. The world may be chaotic. Yet the silence of consciousness remains as a stable background where everything happens. And here lies a common misconception. Many people believe that to access this silence, they need to completely stop their minds. This creates excessive effort, frustration, and often abandonment of observation. But the observer's silence does not depend on the absence of thoughts. It exists even when thoughts are present. Silence does not compete with sound. It sustains it. Just as space doesn't disappear when an object appears within it, silent awareness doesn't disappear when a thought arises. What happens is that attention shifts. When attention is fixed on mental content, silence seems distant. When attention relaxes and observes, silence reveals itself as something ever-present. This is a profoundly psychological and, at the same time, poetic point, because it shows that peace is not in the elimination of human experience, but in the way it is perceived. You don't need to become someone different. You don't need to fix your mind. You don't need to reach a special state. You need to recognize the space where everything is already happening. And that brings a kind of relief that's hard to explain, but easy to feel. When you understand that the observer doesn't speak, you stop looking for verbal answers for everything. You stop demanding that internal experience explain itself. You begin to trust direct perception more. This reduces rumination, decreases overanalysis, and creates a gentler relationship with your own mind. Silence begins to be felt not as a threat, but as support. In a culture that associates silence with discomfort, loneliness, or meaninglessness, this change is profound. Because little by little you realize that inner silence is precisely what allows life to be lived more clearly. It is the space where experience can breathe. And notice how minimalist this is. There is no addition, there is no accumulation, there is removal. Removal of unnecessary comments, removal of automatic judgments, removal of the compulsion to explain everything. The observer's silence doesn't need justification, it simply is. Even when a difficult emotion arises, silence doesn't disappear. It envelops it, it contains it. It allows it to be felt without becoming an identity. And this is extremely relevant to conscious mental health, because emotions cease to be enemies and become transient experiences within a larger field of presence. Perhaps you felt this at specific moments in your life, an instant when something happened, good or bad, and for a brief second, everything became very clear, very simple. No commentary, no story, just the fact happening. That instant was the observer's silence becoming evident. The problem isn't that this silence disappears. It's that it's quickly covered by thoughts trying to explain, judge, or control the experience. But when you learn to recognize silence as presence and not as absence, something changes. You stop running from it. You begin to rest in it. And this repose is not passivity. It is lucidity. The more you become familiar with this silence, the more it begins to manifest in your daily life. In small pauses, in conscious breaths, in moments of real listening, in difficult situations where before there was only reaction, now a small space for perception emerges, and it is in this space that transformation happens, not dramatically, but continuously. From here on, we will explore how this silence persists even when the mind tries to reclaim it, and why learning to recognize it completely changes how you deal with thoughts, emotions, and external situations. But before we continue, I want to open up a space for exchange again, in a simple, effortless way. If this point about silence as presence resonated with you, leave a short, intuitive, unpretentious sentence in the comments. It could be, "Silence is present. Qian or I understand without words." If you want something even simpler, just write silence, presence, or space. These comments help the video reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and philosophy applied to the human experience. And if you feel this content is helping you slow down internally, please like and subscribe, because the next segment delves deeper into how this silence begins to naturally integrate into daily life, even amidst the hustle and bustle. Now, for all of this to cease being just an interesting idea and begin to become a living experience, we need to delve into a simple, visual, and profoundly meditative image. A metaphor that spans centuries of contemplative tradition precisely because it speaks directly to perception, without demanding intellectual effort. The metaphor is this: thoughts are like clouds, and the observer is like the sky. When you look at the sky on any given day, you notice something curious. The clouds are constantly changing. Some are light, almost transparent. Others are dense, dark, and heavy. Some pass quickly. Others remain for hours. But the sky doesn't go away with them. It doesn't need to fight to stay there. It doesn't need to push the clouds to exist. It simply remains, vast, silent, available. Thoughts work exactly like that. They pass. Even those that seem recurring, obsessive, insistent, even those that say, "This will never change." If you observe honestly, you realize that no thought remains identical for very long. It changes in intensity, form, narrative. It dissolves, mixes with others, disappears, and returns with another appearance. Thoughts are movement. The psychological error occurs when you get confused by the cloud and forget about the sky. When a difficult thought arises, the conditioned mind goes into combat mode. It tries to analyze, control, argue, replace. The feeling arises that something needs to be done immediately to get rid of that specific cloud. This generates internal tension, mental fatigue, and a constant feeling of effort. But notice, the sky doesn't do that. The sky doesn't fight the clouds. It doesn't try to understand why they are there. It doesn't wonder how long they will last. It doesn't create an identity based on them. It is simply the space through which they pass. When you begin to perceive the observer as this conscious sky, something profoundly practical happens. You stop waging war with every thought that arises, not because they cease to appear, but because you recognize that they do not have the power to define who you are. They are transient events within a much larger field of consciousness. This awareness is not apathy. It is not indifference. It is inner maturity. Thoughts of fear may pass. Thoughts of doubt may pass. Thoughts of self-criticism may pass. Thoughts of hope also pass. Spiritual thoughts pass. Philosophical thoughts pass. None of them are permanent. None of them is heaven. And perhaps now you can feel this more directly. As you listen to this metaphor, thoughts are passing by. Some comment. Others imagine the sky. Others recall personal situations. But something within you remains stable, observing all of this without moving along with it. This something doesn't need to oppose the thought. It simply watches it pass by. This is one of the most liberating images for conscious mental health, because it dismantles the idea that you need to resolve all your thoughts to feel good. The sky doesn't resolve clouds. It doesn't correct them. It doesn't judge them. It offers space. And space changes everything. When there is space, thought loses its urgency. It doesn't disappear immediately, but it stops shouting. It stops demanding an answer. It stops seeming like an order. And this, in practice, reduces anxiety, rumination, and emotional impulsivity. Not because you did something against your mind, but because you stopped confusing yourself with it. The sky doesn't choose which clouds can pass. It doesn't reject the dark ones nor cling to the light ones. It allows them. And allowing is not agreeing. Allowing is recognizing reality without unnecessary resistance. This inner posture is profoundly Buddhist, profoundly psychological, and profoundly human. It doesn't distance you from life. On the contrary, it returns you to direct experience without excessive layers of interpretation. You begin to live with more clarity because you are not constantly trapped in a mental narrative about what is happening. And here's a very important point. When you realize it's the sky, it doesn't mean you'll never be affected by clouds again. The sky darkens when many clouds pass by. The weather changes. The experience changes. But the sky remains the sky. It doesn't lose its nature because of that. Similarly, you may have difficult days, intense thoughts, dense emotions, challenging situations. This does not invalidate observant awareness. This does not mean you have regressed. It simply means that there are clouds passing by. The more you trust this, the less need you feel to control the inner experience. And less control generates more clarity, more presence, more simplicity. This is the paradox that the analytical mind is slow to accept, but which direct experience confirms. Perhaps you now realize how aesthetic and minimalist this metaphor is. It adds nothing. It removes the struggle. It removes the idea that you need to be in a certain mental state to be okay. It removes the requirement of inner perfection. The sky doesn't seek a clear sky. It already is the sky. And gradually, as this understanding begins to take hold, something changes in how you relate to silence, to thought, and to the very act of being conscious. You begin to rest more in observation and less in reaction. You begin to realize that true stability lies not in the content of the mind, but in the space that sustains it. And it is precisely from here that an even deeper question arises, which we will explore in the next part. What happens when you try to forcefully get rid of the clouds? Why does the struggle against thoughts often strengthen exactly what you want to avoid? This next point further deepens this metaphor and reveals something essential about psychological suffering and conscious freedom. Before we move on, let me ask you something simple. Just now, at the end. If this image of the sky and clouds made sense to you, write a short sentence in the comments without explaining too much. It could be, "I am the sky," or "Thoughts pass by." If you prefer just one word, write space, sky, or presence. These comments help this content reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and philosophy applied to the human experience. And if you felt something inside you breathed a little easier listening to this, leave a like and subscribe. Because from here we enter an even more delicate point about the relationship between observation, resistance, and suffering. After understanding that thoughts pass like clouds and that the observer is the sky that doesn't fight them, it's natural that attention turns to something even more intense, more engaging, and often more difficult to deal with: emotions. Because thoughts can be subtle, almost abstract, but emotions are felt in the body, in the chest, in the breath, in the stomach. They seem more real, more urgent, more personal. And that's precisely why this point is so important for self-knowledge and conscious mental health. Anger, fear, and sadness are not merely psychological states. They are complete experiences involving physical sensations, impulses, mental images, and internal narratives. When they arise, the mind often says, "This is who I am now." And from there, everything narrows. The world becomes smaller. Options seem to disappear. Reaction seems inevitable. But when these emotions are brought under conscious observation, something begins to change. Not because they are denied, but because they cease to be absolute. Let's start with anger. Anger is often one of the most rejected emotions. It comes loaded with energy, tension, and heat. Many people try to repress it, push it down, pretend it's not there. Others do the opposite. They identify completely with it and act from it. In both cases, suffering increases. What is almost never attempted is something much simpler and, at the same time, more profound. Observing anger as it happens. When anger is observed without judgment, without an immediate attempt at control, it begins to reveal its true nature. You realize it's not a solid block. It pulsates. It rises and falls. It has peaks and pauses. It's felt in specific places in the body. And above all, it's perceived by something that isn't in conflict with it. That something is the silent observer. The observer doesn't say that anger is wrong, doesn't say it needs to go away, doesn't try to transform it into something more acceptable. They simply witness it, and that presence changes everything. Because anger, when it encounters neither resistance nor fusion, begins to reorganize itself. It may lose intensity, it may dissolve, or it may simply pass like everything else. The same is true of fear. Fear is often accompanied by racing thoughts, anticipations, and threatening images. The body goes into a state of alert. The mind tries to predict, control, and avoid. But when fear is consciously observed, something interesting happens. You realize that fear is an experience, not a sentence. You perceive the tightness, the acceleration, the restlessness, and at the same time, you perceive that there is a present awareness that is not threatened by fear. The observer is not in danger. He perceives the fear without being consumed by it, and this simple perception creates space. A space where fear can exist without completely dominating the experience. Sadness is perhaps the emotion that most needs to be embraced. It often comes with weight, slowness, and withdrawal. Many times, the mind tries to get rid of it quickly, as if it were a mistake to be corrected. But when sadness is observed with presence, without haste, without rejection, it softens. Not because it disappears instantly, but because it ceases to be solitary. The sadness observed is not abandonment. It is companionship. And here is an essential point that needs to be very clear. The observer does not repress emotions. Repression is an act of the mind trying to control experience. Presence is something else. Presence is allowing the emotion to exist exactly as it is, while you remain aware of the fact that it is being perceived. This difference is fundamental. When you repress, you close yourself off. When you observe, you open yourself up. When you repress, you create tension. When you observe, you create space. And space is the environment where emotion can transform naturally without internal violence. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings about consciousness and spirituality. Many people believe that being conscious means not feeling, not being shaken, not having intense emotions. That's not consciousness. That's dissociation. True consciousness includes everything. It doesn't choose which experiences can exist. It sustains them all, and this has a direct impact on mental health. Observed emotions don't accumulate in the same way. They don't get trapped in the body. They don't transform into chronic patterns as easily, because they were felt, seen, acknowledged. And everything that is acknowledged can move. Perhaps you've already experienced this without realizing it. A moment when you were very emotional, but someone simply stayed present with you, without trying to fix you, without judging you. That presence alone brought relief. The inner observer works the same way. It is that silent presence that doesn't abandon the experience. And little by little, something very important begins to happen. You start to trust more in your ability to feel without losing yourself. You begin to trust that emotions are not enemies, but movements of life happening within you. You begin to realize that you don't need to protect yourself so much from internal experience because there is a conscious space that sustains it. This doesn't mean emotions stop hurting. It means they stop defining who you are. They cease to be the absolute center of your identity. They become part of the experience, not the entirety of it. And when that relationship changes, life changes silently, but profoundly. Internal conflicts soften. Automatic reactions diminish. Self-criticism loses its power. More kindness towards oneself emerges, not through moral effort, but through perceptual clarity. In a moment, we'll move on to an even more delicate point: how this conscious observation directly transforms suffering, and why identification is what keeps psychological pain active for so long. But before we continue, I want to give you an opportunity to participate in this process. If this passage about observing emotions resonated with you, leave a simple, direct sentence in the comments without elaborating too much. It could be, "I observe what I feel," or "Emotions pass." If you prefer just one word, write presence, acceptance, or awareness. These comments help the video reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and a more human and profound approach to emotional experience. And if you feel this content is creating more inner space, please like and subscribe, because the next point delves deeper into exactly how this observation begins to dissolve suffering at its root. As everything falls into place, thoughts passing by, emotions being observed, silence as presence, we arrive at a point that directly touches real life, everyday human suffering, that which no one can ignore for long. Because in the end, we're not just talking about consciousness, philosophy, or Zen aesthetics. We're talking about pain, psychological pain, emotional pain, existential pain. And it is here that observation ceases to be merely an interesting concept and begins to reveal itself as something profoundly liberating. Suffering doesn't arise simply because thoughts exist, nor because emotions appear. If that were the case, everyone would suffer in the same way all the time. Suffering arises when there is identification, when what appears in the mind ceases to be seen as experience and begins to be lived as identity, when a thought is not just a thought, but who I am, when an emotion is not just an emotion, but my truth, when a difficult situation is not just an event, but a confirmation of an old internal story. This is where the experience concludes. When you identify with something, everything becomes intertwined. Thought, emotion, sensation, and identity merge into a single block. There's no room to breathe, there's no distance, there's no perspective. Everything seems definitive, personal, and inescapable. Psychologically, this generates suffering because the mind loses the ability to see alternatives. It enters survival mode, repeating itself and defending itself. But when observation comes into play, something begins to open up. Observe how this works in practice. A painful thought arises. Before, it was automatically believed. Now, it is perceived. This perception already creates a small interval. A difficult emotion appears. Before, it dominated the entire experience. Now it is felt and observed. This simple act of observing creates space, and space changes everything. Space doesn't eliminate pain immediately. It doesn't promise that everything will be all right all the time. What it does is interrupt the automatic cycle of identification. It prevents suffering from solidifying. It restores mobility to experience. This space is subtle, yet powerful. It's the space between you and your thoughts, between you and your emotions, between you and the story your mind tells. And in this space, something emerges that didn't exist before: inner freedom. Inner freedom is not the absence of problems, it is the absence of psychological imprisonment. It is the ability to feel without getting lost, to think without getting confused, to live without constantly being at war with oneself. It is realizing that, even when life gets tough, there is an inner space that is not being crushed along with it. Buddhism points to this very directly. Suffering arises from identification, not from the experience itself, but from the way we cling to it. When you believe you are what is happening, you suffer along with every movement of the mind. When you observe what is happening, you participate in life without being destroyed by it. And perhaps this explains why two people can experience very similar external situations and suffer in completely different ways. It is not the event that defines the suffering, but the degree of identification with the internal experience. Where there is rigid identification, there is prolonged pain. Where there is observation, there is space. Where there is space, there is possibility. This understanding is neither cold nor distant. It doesn't invalidate the pain. It doesn't say, "Don't suffer." On the contrary, it allows the pain to be felt more honestly, without additional layers of resistance, guilt, or judgment. It removes secondary suffering, that suffering created by the thought that the pain shouldn't be there. When observation is present, pain is pain. It doesn't become an identity. It doesn't become a personal failure. It doesn't become a sentence about the future. It is lived as part of the human experience, within a larger field of consciousness that remains intact. And this profoundly changes your relationship with life. You begin to realize that you no longer need to run away from yourself. You don't need to numb yourself. You don't need to harden yourself. There is an inner space capable of containing all of this without collapsing. And this space is not something you create. It is revealed when identification relaxes. This is a delicate point because the conditioned mind likes control. It prefers to fight rather than observe. It prefers to react rather than allow. But observation is not passivity. It is silent intelligence. It is the intelligence of consciousness recognizing its own movements. The more you practice this observation, the easier it becomes to perceive the exact moment when suffering begins to form. Not when the pain arises, but when the mind says, "This is me." That is the key instant. And at that instant, observation can enter and create space. This space doesn't need to be large. Sometimes it's just a second, a sigh, a silent acknowledgement. But that second already changes the trajectory of the experience. It prevents suffering from becoming chronic, hardened, repetitive, and, little by little, you begin to realize something very important. Inner freedom is not about controlling external circumstances, but about a conscious relationship with inner experience. This freedom is silent. It doesn't need to be announced. It is felt as a quiet relief, an inner expansion, a feeling of no longer being so trapped. In a moment, we'll delve even deeper into this point, showing why the observer doesn't need to be created, trained, or manufactured, and how the attempt to achieve this state often pushes away precisely what is already present. But before we continue, I want to hear from you, calmly, without rushing. If this point about suffering and identification resonated with you, leave a simple, direct sentence in the comments that represents your experience right now. It could be, "I am not my pain," or "There's room." If you prefer just one word, write space, freedom, or consciousness. These comments help this content reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and a freer way of living their own experience. And if you feel that something here has started to loosen up inside, leave a like and subscribe, because the next section delves deeper into exactly why you never needed to create the observer, only recognize it. Having arrived at this point after traversing thoughts, emotions, silence, and suffering, it's very common for the mind to try to do something with all of this. It's almost automatic. It hears about the silent observer, about presence, about inner space, and immediately the idea arises. Then I need to achieve this. I need to create this state. I need to learn how to do this right. And it is precisely at this point that many people, without realizing it, distance themselves from what was already closer than ever. Therefore, this excerpt is crucial, perhaps one of the most important parts of the entire video, because it dismantles an unnecessary search. You don't need to create the observer. He's already there. Even before you heard these words, before you tried to understand anything, before you even considered whether this made sense or not, something within you was already conscious. Something was already perceiving sounds, images, sensations, thoughts. This something didn't just appear now. It didn't emerge because you became interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, or Buddhist philosophy. It was always there. The common mistake is to think that the observer is a special state that arises only when the mind is calm, silent, or controlled. But observe honestly. Even when the mind is agitated, someone perceives that agitation. Even when there is confusion, someone perceives the confusion. Even when there is effort, someone perceives the effort. That someone is the observing consciousness. And that's precisely why the attempt to create the observer often leads to frustration. Because you end up using your mind to try to produce something that already exists before the mind. It's like trying to turn on a flashlight to find the sun. Meditation, from this perspective, is not a manufacturing technique. It doesn't create awareness. It doesn't add anything. It reveals. It points out. It removes obstacles. It shows what is already happening when you stop interfering so much. Meditation is not about forcing silence. Meditation is not about stopping thoughts. Meditating is not about entering a perfect state. To meditate is to perceive. To perceive what is there when you are not trying to change anything. To perceive the flow of experience as it is. To realize that even amidst the internal noise, there is a presence that does not depend on the noise to exist. When this is seen, even if only for a few seconds, something profound relaxes. And here arises an important paradox. The more you strive to reach the observer, the more distant they seem. The more you try to hold on to their presence, the more it eludes you. Because excessive effort reinforces the idea that something is missing. And this idea of lack is created by the mind, not by direct experience. The observer cannot be reached. He recognizes himself. This recognition doesn't come with fireworks. It's simple, almost too discreet for a mind accustomed to intense stimuli. Often it comes as a feeling of, this was already here, a silent relief, a clarity without euphoria. And it is at this point that many people get confused and think that nothing happened. But something did happen. The mind just couldn't find something to focus on. Excessive effort alienates because it creates tension. It transforms observation into a task. It transforms presence into an objective. And everything that becomes an objective becomes something that can be lost, failed, or poorly executed. But the observer cannot be lost, because he is the very fact of being conscious. Even now, if you stop trying to understand and simply notice that you are listening, something is already happening. You don't need to do anything to listen. Listening happens. Awareness happens. Perception happens. The observer is operating without asking permission. This completely changes your relationship with meditative practices, self-knowledge, and even mindfulness therapy. Instead of seeking ideal states, you begin to take an interest in real experience. Instead of trying to get rid of what arises, you learn to recognize the space where everything arises. And this has a direct effect on mental health, because internal pressure decreases. The pressure to be okay decreases. The comparison with idealized experiences decreases. You begin to allow yourself to be human without losing your presence. Many people abandon this path because they think they're doing it wrong, because they can't quiet their minds, because they feel difficult emotions, because they get distracted. But all of that was included from the beginning. The observer doesn't demand perfection. He doesn't demand performance. He's present even when you think you've failed. Perhaps this is one of the most compassionate aspects of this entire approach. You don't need to become someone different to be conscious. You don't need to correct your experience to deserve presence. You don't need to wait for the right moment. Consciousness is not in the future. It is here now, perceiving even the idea of the future. And the more you relax this search, the more natural everything becomes. Observation begins to appear spontaneously in simple moments. In the middle of a conversation, in a moment of silence, in an unexpected emotion, not as something extraordinary, but as something familiar. This doesn't mean you'll never put in the effort again. It means that effort ceases to be the focus. It stops being compulsive. It stops being stressful. Practice becomes curiosity, not pressure. Presence, not performance. And it is from here that a very subtle but decisive change emerges. You begin to trust your own direct experience more than ideas about it. You begin to realize when you are trying too hard. You begin to notice when the mind transforms presence into a project. And in this noticing, something is released. From here on, we're going to delve into an even more direct and practical experience. A simple, almost imperceptible invitation that shows how to recognize the observer in the midst of ordinary life, without rituals, without preparation, without extra effort. But before we continue, I want to leave a little space for you to express yourself. If this point about not needing to create the observer made sense to you, leave a short, spontaneous sentence in the comments. It could be, "I was already here," or "I don't need to search," If you prefer just one word, write recognize, presence, or clarity. These comments help this content reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and a gentler approach to the human experience. And if you feel this video is helping you relax your search and deepen your perception, please like and subscribe, because the next segment is a direct invitation to the experience, simple, silent, and transformative. Now, after everything that has been said, it makes no sense to continue with just words, because there is a very clear limit where the explanation has already served its purpose. From this point on, any attempt to understand more with the mind begins to go in circles, and that is precisely why this moment is different. It is not a new concept. It is not an idea. It is not a psychological or philosophical theory. It is a direct invitation to experience. Simple, practical, conscious, effortless. You don't need to change your posture. You don't need to close your eyes if you don't want to. You don't need to create a special atmosphere. The experience happens exactly where you are, just as you are. Because, as we saw before, the observer doesn't depend on ideal conditions. They are already present. So, for a few moments, just allow words to diminish in importance. Observe your breathing for 3 seconds. Don't try to control it. Don't try to make it profound. Don't try to breathe the right way. Just observe. Air is coming in. The air is escaping. The natural movement happening on its own. Perhaps your mind wants to comment. Perhaps a thought will arise saying, "Am I doing this right?" Or, "This is too simple." That's okay. Don't fight it. Remember the metaphor of the sky. Thoughts may pass. You don't have to follow them. Now, while the breathing continues, notice something even more subtle. Notice that you are observing your breathing. Don't think about it. Just acknowledge it. There is breath, and there is the awareness of breath. Something within you knows that air is going in and out. This knowing doesn't need words. It's direct, silent, present. Stay there for a few more seconds. Perhaps you will realize that there is no effort involved in this observation. The breathing happens. The observation happens. There is no doer pushing this. Everything is simply occurring within a field of consciousness that was already active before this invitation. Now gently shift your attention to something even simpler. Notice who is watching. Don't look for an image. Don't expect a verbal response. Don't try to find something special. Just note that there is an observation. This noticing has no form. It has no borders. It has no identity. It doesn't say, "I am this." It simply is, present, silent, clear. If the mind tries to appropriate this, observe the attempt. If confusion arises, observe the confusion. If calm arises, observe the calm. All of this appears in the same conscious space, and notice something important. At no point was it necessary to create the observer. You didn't do anything to make it appear. You simply stopped ignoring it for a few seconds. This is the central point of this mini exercise. The experience isn't grandiose, it's honest. And that's precisely why it's transformative, because it shows directly that consciousness isn't in the future. It isn't at the end of the video. It isn't in an advanced state of meditation. It's here now, perceiving even this exact moment. Allow yourself a few more moments of inner silence, even if there are external sounds, even if there are thoughts, even if there are subtle emotions. Silence is not the absence of all of this. Silence is the space where all of this happens. Perhaps you'll realize that when there's no effort, something naturally relaxes. The body doesn't need to be corrected. The mind doesn't need to be silenced. The experience organizes itself when there is observation without interference. This is the kind of silence that doesn't distance you from life. It brings you closer. It fosters intimacy with your own experience. It makes everything simpler, more direct, more real. And perhaps now it makes sense why so many traditions point to mindfulness, to presence, to the simple act of observing, not as a technique to achieve something, but as a constant reminder of what has never ceased to be there. Before we move on to the next point, just acknowledge one last thing. You just observed. You were just present, and nothing needed to be created. This recognition, even if brief, is enough to change the way you relate to your mind, your emotions, and your daily life. Because now, there is an internal reference point that doesn't depend on thoughts. In the next part, we'll talk about how this observer begins to manifest in everyday life, in common situations, in conflicts, in anxiety, in relationships, and how this simple practice becomes something alive, integrated, and real. But before we continue, I want to invite you to mark this moment. If you felt this mini practice in any way, even subtly, leave a short sentence in the comments without explaining too much. It could be, "I observed," or "I was there." If you prefer just one word, write breath, presence, or silence. These comments help this content reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and a practical, simple, and profound approach to the human experience. And if you felt this moment brought you a little deeper, leave a like and subscribe, because from here we enter the part where this observation begins to walk alongside you in real life. Now that you've had direct contact with this silent observation, the natural question that arises is, okay, this works here, in this moment of pause. But what about in real life? What about in the midst of chaos, pressures, relationships, and daily anxiety? It is precisely here that everything becomes truly relevant, because the observer was not made to exist only in moments of silence or introspection. Above all, it reveals itself in everyday life. Let's start with the discussions. A tense conversation begins. Someone says something that affects you. Immediately, an internal reaction arises. Tension in the body, acceleration, defensive thoughts, the urge to explain yourself, to attack, or to shut down. Usually all this happens so quickly that you're already reacting before you even realize it. But when observation is present, even minimally, something changes. You notice the reaction arising. You notice the tightness. You notice the impulse. You notice the thoughts organizing themselves into arguments. And, in that simple noticing, a small space emerges. This space doesn't prevent you from speaking. It doesn't make you passive. It simply gives you back choice. Instead of being swept away by reaction, you begin to respond with more clarity. Sometimes there is still emotion, there is still firmness, there are still limits, but there is less loss of self in the process. The observer doesn't erase the conflict, but prevents you from becoming completely confused by it. The same is true for anxiety. Anxiety is often one of the most difficult experiences because it intensely mixes thought, emotion, and body. The future invades the present. The body reacts as if something is wrong right now. The mind tries to predict, control, and avoid. When there is no self-awareness, anxiety becomes an identity. I am anxious. Something is wrong with me. This will never pass. But when anxiety is observed, something begins to reorganize itself. You notice the acceleration, the tightness, the flow of anticipatory thoughts. And at the same time, you realize that all of this is being seen. The observer doesn't say, "This shouldn't be happening." They simply acknowledge, "This is happening now." This simple shift defuels the cycle. Anxiety may still be there, but it doesn't occupy everything. It ceases to be the absolute center of the experience. And here's an important point. Observing anxiety isn't about trying to calm down. It's not about forcing your breathing. It's not about convincing yourself that everything will be all right. It's about allowing anxiety to exist within a larger space of awareness. And, paradoxically, that's what usually reduces its intensity over time. Now think about social media, perhaps one of the most challenging environments for consciousness today. Automatic scrolling, constant comparison, endless stimuli, external validation. How many times have you found yourself consuming content without knowing why? Or comparing yourself to edited lives? Or feeling empty after spending too much time there? The observer completely transforms this relationship, because the moment you realize you're operating on autopilot, observation has already taken over. The instant you notice the comparison arising, something shifts. You perceive the thought, "My life isn't enough," and upon realizing this, it no longer holds the same power. The networks continue to exist. The content continues to appear, but you don't disappear within it. The observer brings presence back even in the use of technology. It reminds you that you are alive, here, now, while consuming images and stories. It creates the possibility of conscious choice, to continue or stop, to engage or withdraw, to compare or simply observe. And perhaps one of the most delicate areas of all is self-criticism. That inner voice that judges, demands, compares, diminishes. For many people, this voice seems to be the truth. It speaks so frequently that it's confused with who you are. But when you begin to observe self-criticism, something fundamental happens. It ceases to be an authority and becomes a phenomenon. You notice the tone, the repeated phrases, the unrealistic demands, and upon noticing, something is released. The observer doesn't argue with self-criticism, doesn't try to overcome it, doesn't try to replace it with positive phrases. He simply sees it as yet another conditioned mental pattern. And this generates a profound kind of compassion. Not that idealized compassion, but a practical, silent compassion that arises when you stop confusing yourself with internal violence. You begin to treat yourself with more space, more patience, more humanity. What all these situations have in common is simple. The observer appears the moment you realize what is happening, not afterwards, not when everything is resolved, but at the exact instant of noticing. This noticing can be brief. Sometimes it lasts a second, but it is already enough to change the quality of the experience. And the more this is repeated in daily life, the more natural it becomes. Observation ceases to be something you do and becomes something that happens. It begins to accompany you like a silent backdrop to life. Not all the time, not perfectly, but increasingly accessible. That's integration. This is spirituality applied to real life. This is conscious mental health in action. You don't become distant, cold, or indifferent. On the contrary, you become more present, more sensitive, more lucid, because you are no longer completely lost in the contents of your mind. There is an inner point that observes, sustains, and accompanies you. And it is from this presence in daily life that something even deeper begins to reveal itself. Something that has nothing to do with isolated moments, but with a silent and continuous transformation of the way you relate to your own experience. That is exactly what we will explore in the next part. Before we move on, I want to give you some space to recognize yourself in this. In the comments, write about a situation where you notice this already happening, even subtly. It could be a word or a short phrase, such as, "I realized it amidst the anxiety," or "I observed before reacting." If you prefer something simple, just write, "day by day," presence, or clarity. These comments help this video reach more people who are seeking exactly this integration between awareness, real life, and mental health. And if this content is making sense to you, leave a like and subscribe, because the next part goes into an even deeper layer of this silent transformation that begins to happen when the observer starts walking with you. As the observer begins to integrate into daily life, something curious happens. There isn't an exact moment when you can say, "Now everything has changed." There's no dramatic turning point, no explosive feeling of enlightenment. What happens is more subtle, more silent, and precisely for that reason, more real. The transformation doesn't arrive announcing its presence. It infiltrates how you react, how you perceive, the tone with which you treat yourself internally. The first change almost always appears as less reactivity. Situations that previously triggered automatic responses begin to find a small interval, not because you've learned to control yourself better, but because you've become more aware sooner. The body still reacts. Thoughts still arise, emotions still appear, but something doesn't completely shut down. There's a fraction of a second where observation kicks in, and that fraction changes the course of the experience. Before, the reaction came whole, compact, inevitable. Now, it comes accompanied by awareness, and awareness dissolves rigidity. You can even respond firmly, set boundaries, express discomfort, but without that feeling of having been kidnapped from within. After the event, there is less regret, less rumination, less internal dialogue repeating the scene. This is not forced self-control. It is clarity emerging in place of identification, And this reduction in reactivity doesn't just happen with the external world. It happens primarily with yourself. Self-criticism begins to lose momentum. That inner voice that once seemed absolute starts to be perceived as just another pattern. It still speaks, still comments, still demands, but it no longer has the same power. You no longer need to obey automatically. You listen, you perceive, and something within you remains intact. This profoundly changes your relationship with yourself. With less reactivity, more clarity emerges. Clarity not in the sense of having all the answers, but in the sense of seeing more clearly what is happening. You begin to perceive your own emotional patterns with more honesty. You notice when you are tired. You notice when you are demanding too much of yourself. You notice when you are getting lost in unrealistic expectations. And this perception doesn't come with heavy judgment. It comes as a simple recognition. This is what is happening now. This clarity is extremely practical for conscious mental health, because much suffering persists, not because it is intense, but because it is confusing. When everything is mixed up, thought, emotion, identity, suffering is prolonged. When there is clarity, even pain finds its shape. It becomes navigable. You know where you stand. Clarity also changes the way you make decisions. Not because you become cold or distant, but because you start listening better. You realize when you're acting out of fear, when you're seeking approval, when you're avoiding feeling something. And, upon realizing this, the possibility arises to choose in a way that is more aligned with what truly matters to you. And perhaps the most profound change of all is that more kindness towards oneself begins to emerge. This kindness doesn't come as a pretty idea like, I need to love myself more. It arises naturally when self-identification diminishes. When you stop completely confusing yourself with your mistakes, your flaws, your internal difficulties. When you realize that thoughts and emotions don't define who you are, the self-criticism loses some of its basis. The internal rigidity begins to give way. You begin to treat yourself as someone living a real human experience, not as a project that needs to be perfect all the time. This changes the tone of your internal dialogue. It changes how you deal with relapses, difficult days, and moments of confusion. Instead of internal violence, space emerges. Instead of punishment, understanding arises. This kindness doesn't make you passive. It makes you more resilient, because you don't spend so much energy fighting against yourself. You start using that energy to be present, to learn, to move forward with more wholeness. And all of this happens without continuous conscious effort. It's not something you need to constantly remember. Observation becomes a silent backdrop to the experience. Sometimes more evident, sometimes more distant, but present enough to prevent you from getting completely lost for long periods. Silent transformation doesn't eliminate challenges. It changes how you relate to them. It doesn't promise constant happiness. It offers progressive inner freedom, a freedom that doesn't depend on your mood of the day, external approval, or perfect circumstances. And perhaps the most interesting thing is to realize that this transformation doesn't come from adding something new to your life, but from removing excesses, removing rigid identification, removing the need to control everything, removing the demand to be someone specific all the time. What remains is something simple, stable, and profoundly human. You begin to live more mindfully in the small moments, to notice when you're breathing deeply without realizing it, to notice when a reaction doesn't happen as it used to recognize when you choose to remain silent instead of defending yourself. These details don't attract external attention, but they build a much more habitable inner life. And the more this solidifies, the more you realize that transformation isn't something that happens to you, but something that happens through you. Not as an isolated event, but as a continuous process of clarity, space, and kindness. It is precisely from this point that an interesting paradox arises, which we will explore below. The more this transformation deepens, the less you feel the need to prove that you have changed. Less need to define yourself, less need to explain yourself. Something begins to dissolve silently, not only in the way you react, but in the very idea of who you thought you needed to be. Before we continue, I want to create a simple space for you to recognize yourself in this process. In the comments, write a short sentence that represents what you've noticed about yourself so far. It could be less reaction or more space. If you prefer just one word, write clarity, kindness, or presence. These comments help this video reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and real inner transformation without exaggeration. And if you feel something is silently changing inside you, leave a like and subscribe, because in the next part, we delve even deeper into identity, detachment, and the final paradox of this observation. Reaching this point, something inevitable begins to happen within those who are truly present and engaged, a kind of silent short circuit. Because everything that has been said so far, thoughts like clouds, emotions under observation, inner space, silent transformation, begins to point to a place where the mind can no longer advance in its usual way. And it is precisely here that the final paradox arises. A simple point to state, but impossible to resolve using ordinary logic. The observer cannot be seen as an object because it is the observer who sees. The moment that phrase is actually heard, something tries to happen in the mind. It tries to locate the observer. It tries to imagine them. It tries to describe them. It tries to transform them into something that can be understood, defined, grasped. But every attempt fails. And not for lack of intelligence, but because the attempt itself stems from a fundamental misunderstanding. Everything that you can see, perceive, name, or describe appears within consciousness. Thoughts appear, emotions appear, sensations appear, mental images appear, even ideas about spirituality, presence, and observation appear. But that which perceives all this does not appear in the same way. It does not enter the field as an object among others. And this often generates a strange feeling, a slight discomfort, sometimes even frustration, because the mind has been trained to always operate from objects, something that can be observed, analyzed, compared. But here, for the first time, it encounters something that cannot be put in front of it, because it is behind everything. It's like trying to use your eyes to see the act of seeing itself. You can see reflections, images, mirrors, but seeing itself doesn't become an object. It's the condition for any object to be seen. Similarly, the observer is the condition for any experience to be perceived. This is the paradox that dismantles the traditional spiritual quest based on achieving something. Because there is no way to achieve what is already the starting point. There is no way to observe that which is observation itself. Every attempt to do so generates only another thought, another image, another idea, all observed. And here something very interesting happens for those who are paying attention. For a moment, the mind is left without a task. It cannot move forward. It cannot go back. It cannot solve anything. And in that interval, however brief, something silently reveals itself, not as a response, but as an acknowledgement. You realize that you've always been looking from that place, never towards it. And this completely changes how you relate to your own identity. Because, until then, identity was constructed from observable things, personal history, psychological traits, recurring emotions, thought patterns. But now it's clear that all of this is seen. And if it's seen, it can't be what it sees. This understanding does not create a new spiritual identity. On the contrary, it begins to dissolve the need for a fixed identity. A sense of openness arises, of no longer needing to define oneself all the time, of no longer needing to answer the question, "Who am I?" internally with words. And this is a point that often generates a lot of comments because it touches on something very intimate. Many people feel it as liberation, others as vertigo, others as profound silence. There is no right or wrong reaction. All are observed. When faced with this paradox, the mind often tries to protect itself. It might say, "This is too abstract," or "This leads nowhere," or "This isn't practical." But notice, these are merely attempts to regain control, because at that point, there is no more control possible. There is only recognition, And recognition isn't something you do. It happens. When you realize that the observer cannot be seen as an object, something deeply relaxes. The search loses its urgency. The need to arrive somewhere diminishes. The idea of spiritual progress begins to seem strange, not because nothing changes, but because the essential point was never absent. This paradox also explains why so many people spend years seeking extraordinary experiences and yet feel something is missing, because they are looking within the field of experience for something that is the basis of experience. They are looking at the content, when everything has always been happening on the surface. And when this begins to become clear, observation becomes even quieter, less effort, less trying, less need to understand. The mind learns little by little not to interfere so much, not to turn everything into a problem or an objective. You begin to realize that you no longer need to answer all the internal questions. Some questions dissolve on their own when viewed closely. Others simply lose relevance. The observer doesn't need answers to exist. This point also changes how you listen to other people, other content, other ideas. You begin to notice when something is just another object being presented to the mind, and you notice when something points back to the observer. This difference becomes increasingly clear, and perhaps now it makes sense why this point tends to increase retention and engagement so much. Because it doesn't deliver a closed conclusion, it opens up a space where each person needs to look for themselves, where there's no way to delegate the experience, where there's no way to believe instead of perceiving. And this space is disconcerting, but also profoundly honest. You can try to explain it later. You can try to put it into words. You can try to share it, but something always escapes, because it's not about content that can be transmitted like information. It's about a direct, intimate, silent recognition. And the more you become familiar with this paradox, the more you realize that it's not something to be solved, but something to be lived, not as a special state, but as the constant backdrop of experience. It's present when you think, when you feel, when you react, when you observe the reaction. It never leaves the scene. It is precisely from this point that the path becomes even more subtle. Because when the observer ceases to be sought as an object, a new way of being present in life emerges. A presence without a fixed center, without effort, without the need to assert oneself. And that is what we will delve into next, exploring how to live from this recognition without transforming it into just another concept or identity. Before we move on, I want to invite you to participate in this step in a simple way. In the comments, write what most closely resembles your experience right now, without trying to explain too much. It could be, "There's nothing to see," or "I am what you see." If you prefer just one word, write paradox, consciousness, or silence. These comments help this video reach more people interested in self-knowledge, conscious mental health, and philosophy applied to real human experience. And if this point made you pause internally, leave a like and subscribe, because the next part doesn't resolve this paradox. It shows how to live with it in a simple, vivid, and profoundly human way. And after all this, perhaps the most honest thing to do is not to explain anything more. Perhaps the most coherent thing to do is to slow down, to reduce the number of words, to reduce the need to understand. Because if you have followed along this far with real attention, something has already begun to shift inside, not noisily, not as a logical conclusion, but as a silent feeling of recognition. There is a moment, almost imperceptible, when the mind tires of trying to capture, when it realizes it has gone far enough. And when that happens, something simpler takes its place, an effortless presence, a being without comment, a realization that there is no need to justify oneself. Perhaps you notice this in small intervals throughout the video, those seconds when you weren't thinking about what would come next. You weren't evaluating whether you agreed or disagreed. You were just there, listening, feeling, perceiving. These intervals are not distractions, they are clues, because that which observes these intervals is the same that observes thoughts, emotions, stories, and even the idea of being in a video searching for something. It was never absent. It was simply ignored while attention was too busy trying to define itself, correct itself, explain itself, and perhaps that's why this path is unlike others. It doesn't promise a better version of you. It doesn't promise to eliminate your flaws. It doesn't promise definitive answers. It simply points repeatedly to something that has always been working silently in the background. You can even try to turn this into yet another concept. You can try to appropriate the idea of observer. Nay, you can try to define yourself as someone conscious, someone awakened, someone who has understood something profound. But if you observe honestly, you will realize that all these attempts are also seen. And what you see doesn't need to be defined by any of them. This is where things really start to mature, not as an event, not as an achievement, but as a growing intimacy with one's own experience. You begin to live from a slightly broader place, a little more spacious, a little less constricted by internal narratives. Things continue to happen, good days, difficult days, confused emotions, moments of clarity, but there's a subtle difference in how all of this is sustained internally. There is less urgency to prove something, less of a rush to get somewhere, less self-harm when things don't go as planned. And this doesn't happen because you decided to be this way. It happens because when identification relaxes, kindness naturally emerges. When effort diminishes, clarity increases. When the search slows down, presence reveals itself. Perhaps you'll begin to realize that you no longer need to fill all the silences, that some spaces don't require answers, that some questions don't need to be resolved, only kept open. And keeping something open isn't a lack of intelligence, it's conscious maturity. This type of presence doesn't draw attention, it doesn't generate applause, it doesn't create a strong identity to show the world. It's discreet, functional, alive. It manifests itself in the way you listen to someone without interrupting, in the way you perceive a reaction before acting, in the way you take a deep breath without needing a special reason. And, little by little, this begins to reflect outwards. Not because you're trying to teach someone something, but because your way of being changes. People sense when someone is less stuck, less reactive, more present, not as an ideal, but as a silent reality. Perhaps that's why so many traditions speak of silence at the end, not as an absence of content, but as a recognition that the words have already fulfilled their function. Silence here is not the end. It is the space where everything continues to happen without being interrupted by unnecessary explanations. And it is precisely in this space that this phrase begins to make sense, not as something to believe, but as something to feel. Perhaps you were never who you thought you were, but that's what he's always been observing. This is not a statement to be repeated, it's an invitation to be verified. Now, here, at this very moment, as you listen to these words, something is perceiving you. Even if you can't say what, even if you can't point it out, even if you can't explain it. This something doesn't ask for effort. It doesn't ask for agreement. It doesn't ask you to do anything other than not immediately distance yourself from the experience. Perhaps it will be enough to just stay a few more seconds, without searching, without analyzing. Not finished, just a gift. If this video touched you deeply in a silent way, let it be known, not as an obligation, but as a conscious gesture. At the end, write a short, simple, intuitive sentence in the comments. It could be, "I was watching," or "something remained." If you prefer just one word, write "silence," "presence," or "here." This helps this space reach more people who are ready for this type of deep, psychological, and conscious content. If you feel like it, enjoy the video. Share it with someone you feel needs less answers and more space. And if you can, do something rare. When the video ends, don't rush to the next stimulus. Remain silent for a few seconds, without doing anything with it, without trying to take anything away, just letting the experience settle in. Because sometimes, what matters most isn't what you take with you, but what do you stop carrying?